fourth now masterclass. Welcome to our fourth masterclass as part of our Changemaker Exchange AI initiative, helping young changemakers navigate the world of AI. And today, I think a particularly juicy topic. We're encouraging everyone to hit pause on the hype button and the AI hype to look today at the often hidden environmental cost. I think we're often treating AI like it's magical, invisible, living in the cloud. So the thorny question for today is, what is the planetary price tag for this technology? And to help us unmask this, we're super fortunate to have with us a real brilliant voice on the environmental impact of artificial intelligence, Dr. Sasha Luccioni, and we'll hand over to her shortly. The flow for today, we're going to have a very quick check-in and a couple of quick interactive activities just to bring us together a little. We'll then have some insights from Sasha, around 30 minutes, and then go into a moderated question and answer with Sasha. Well, you'll have the chance to ask her the things burning for you. This is obviously a huge topic and one we all need to reckon with. It's also one where we're sharing some key resources around and tackle in our Mindful AI policy and manifesto and on our resource page. The link to that is in the chat. Okay, first of all, I know these big group calls can sometimes feel a little impersonal, so I'd love to do a quick activity to connect us all a little. And I'm going to have a few instructions for you here. First, I would love you to go to the small camera button where you can see the video and hit the small triangle arrow next to that. There you will see an option with video settings. I want you to also hit that. And then finally there, I would love you to go to check the box, tick the box where it says hide non-video participants. So go to your camera, then choose video settings, then choose hide non-video participants. I would also love you to all put your videos on for 1 minute, if possible. So as many of you as you can, I would love you to open your videos so we can see you. And I'm going to ask a few questions. When you think the answer to this question is yes, I would love you to keep your video on. If you think the answer is no, turn your video off, and you will see what happens as a result of this. Okay, my first question, would love to know who's joining these masterclasses for the first time today. Who's is their first AI masterclass? Welcome to you all. Good to see you. Okay, who's joined before? Who's joined at least one of the previous 4? Turn your video off if you haven't. Okay, welcome back. Good to see so many of you. Next question, just to get a sense of who's in the room. Who are the non-profit, civil society, social entrepreneurship people in the room? Videos on. Okay, nice. You're very welcome. Who's in particular working on environmental issues? Put your cameras on. Okay. Relatively small group of us today. Good to have you all with us. Anyone working in the private sector? Cameras on. Okay, we have a few people there as well. You're also welcome. Can we see who are the AI enthusiasts in the room? Put your cameras on. Okay. I have here Jorge, Mohammed, Deepak, Salma, Nadir, you're very welcome. Who are the skeptics? Cameras off the enthusiasts, and let's see who are the AI skeptics. Put your cameras on. Okay, you're equally welcome. And a few people kind of maybe having their camera on for both. And finally, Who here feels in a bit of a dilemma between really being curious, wanting to use AI, but worried about the negative environmental, social impact? Okay, good. We have lots of people here. Okay, you're in the right place for today's topic. Thank you for joining as well. Okay, we're going to also dive a little bit deeper onto that before I hand over to Sasha. And Miriam is going to pop into the chat the link to a Slido quick quiz, which you will get in your chat popping up now. And you can also join it in case you're having any issues with the Zoom plugin. You can join it directly on the website, and the link is now in the chat for you there. So I'd love you to join that Slido, and we're going to have some questions for you on there. The first one, and I'm also going to share my screen so you can see other people's answers on this. First one is how you feel when you're using an AI tool like ChatGPT. What's your dominant feeling? Are you blissfully ignorant, runs on the cloud? Are you vaguely guilty? Are you curious, you have no idea? Or are you worried? You're thinking about the environmental impact with every prompt. Okay, interesting. And new people arriving, you're also very welcome. We're doing an interactive quiz to gauge a little the pulse of the room on environment and AI. The link to the Slido is in the chat. So almost half the people feel vaguely guilty, 38% worried, 19% curious, not having any idea. I hope that sets the scene a little for you there, Sasha. Looking at the big picture, do we think AI will ultimately help or hurt the climate crisis? Is it the savior? It's going to invent fusion, optimize grids, save the planet? Is it just a distraction, another shiny tool that won't change the outcome much? Or is it the villain, that the energy demands of AI will accelerate the climate crisis? Okay, let's see what we have here. About half the people thinking it's just a distraction, another shiny tool won't change the outcome. A third think AI is gonna save us from the climate crisis, and 20% think it's gonna exacerbate it. Okay, two more questions. Next one, who do you think is most responsible for making AI greener? Is it big tech? They built the models, they need to clean them up. Is it governments? We need regulation, carbon taxes. Is it us, the users? Do we need to be more mindful, intentional about the tools that we use? Or is it the energy sector and needing more renewables to power it all? Okay, thanks for your answers there. We have almost 3/4 of you thinking big tech. Wow, more and more people also putting the responsibility onto the governments, and just 10% on the users. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we can see here, I think that it's a bit of a black box, the whole environmental impact of AI, and that we have someone with us today who I think can help to open up that black box a little and help us see inside it. I want you to continue using the Slido to put in your questions for Sasha as she's speaking. You now have the Q&A option, whereas you were in the poll before. And without further ado, Sasha, the floor and the mic is yours. Looking forward. Really exciting to hear from you.
Thank you. Can you see my slides? Yes? Okay,
Yes.
cool. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Just to give a brief overview, I'm the climate lead at Hugging Face, which is a big platform for sharing open source AI models and datasets. And my job essentially consists of evaluating both the environmental and societal impacts of these models and datasets. And there are two particular topics, I guess, that I cared deeply about above and beyond AI. It's women in machine learning. So there's a big gender crisis in machine learning and in artificial intelligence as tech in general, but it's worse. So women represent about 15%. So I'm part of Women in Machine Learning, which essentially organizes conferences and tries to help promote women in the field. And then Climate Change AI, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is really the go-to organization at the crossroads between climate change and artificial intelligence. So just to give you a little background about my story as well, I used to work at Morgan Stanley. Yes, no one is perfect. After my PhD, I needed a job, and that was a fairly interesting one, actually. I have nothing to say about the AI problems themselves. It was actually a really great learning experience, but I did feel that my skills could be better used in the fight against climate change and not to make Wall Street more money. And so essentially in 2019, I left Morgan Stanley and I joined Mila, which is a nonprofit research lab here in Montreal. And at the time, Yoshua Bengio, who later went on to win the Turing Award, which is like the Nobel Prize in computer science, he was hiring someone to lead the efforts in climate change and AI. So essentially how to use artificial intelligence to fight climate change. And then I ended up doing that for 3 years. Essentially, academia is very much like a pyramid scheme in that sense because I was a postdoc, which means that I was supervising PhD students and supervising master's students and reporting to Joshua. And we did some really cool work. And then 4 years ago now, I joined Hugging Face, and I've been working there ever since. And so the way I kind of want to frame this talk is, the dichotomy between AI for climate and AI costing the climate. And my research really stands in the middle. And the reason I want to take this angle is because I think that we hear a lot from both sides of the story. On the one hand, you have training AI, a single AI can emit as much as 5 cars in their lifetimes. Tech companies helping big oil, or AI will solve the climate crisis, right? You have all these very conflicting messages, and so I wanted to help you kind of understand them a little bit better. But first, I think it's really useful to talk about AI in general before going into the climate side of things. So I'll start with a very, very brief history of AI, and of course, this is my own personal take on it. Definitely, there's multiple narratives to this story. So what is AI? This is actually something that would warrant a presentation in itself, but the way that I like to think about it is it's a technology that enables machines to simulate intelligent processes and not have them, like learning, comprehension, problem solving, and decision making. And so this is a little bit of maybe an old school vision of things that I don't believe that computers can ever be intelligent or have intelligence, but they can simulate intelligence, or they can at least simulate certain ways of manifesting intelligence, like problem solving, decision making, etc. But that does not make them intelligent as such. Very debatable, very debated currently. So we can also talk about that if you want at some point. And in terms of a history of AI, I know that most people probably only heard about it a couple of years ago, but it actually goes back. It goes back to the 1950s. The actual term AI was coined in 1956. And it's interesting because at the time there was this hope and a lot of optimism around AI. And so it was founded. And we have, for example, the Eliza chatbot, which was around that time, which would mimic mental health therapy. And there was a lot of promise and a lot of funding put into this. And then we had a first AI winter in the 70s because essentially we found that, I mean, people at the time found that they overpromised and underdelivered, and people were kind of disillusioned with AI. So we had a first AI winter, and this was symbolic AI. This was really kind of like rule-based systems, like if blah, 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 then blah, blah. Then we have rule-based systems that were kind of came back and started being used in things like medicine and things like I don't know, supply chain management, etc. And once again, they were promised to solve all the problems, and once again, they didn't. And so we had a second AI winter in the late 80s, early 90s. Then in the 90s, we have this era of machine learning, so really learning from data instead of programming explicitly rules, but learning patterns from data. So IBM Watson is a great example of that. And then since 2011, we have this what's called the deep learning revolution. So really these deeper neural networks, like different approaches. And since the last couple of years, we've had generative AI specifically. So what's so special about machine learning, the most recent kind of turn in that road? So it's really an approach that aims to make computers really process data and make predictions in a way that's inspired by the human brain. So like neural networks were really inspired by the neurons in our brain. And so they're interconnected. There are these nodes that process information and learn patterns. And so when you connect thousands or billions of these neurons together, you can recognize complex patterns and pictures, text, sound, and other data. So this is really kind of like the last generation of AI or machine learning. And just to give you an example, the first kind of generations of machine learning models specifically were, for example, trained on this is a data set called MNIST, and essentially it's handwritten digits. And this was one of the very, very first data sets in the 90s for machine learning. And based on a system like this, we had postal triage systems. So essentially, you have AI that can recognize addresses and or postal codes or zip codes and send letters in the right postal office, essentially. And so we've been using machine learning for postal triage for decades, and the systems were very well fairly good and used kind of widely. Nowadays, we have a lot more data. We have a lot more categories. It's not just like numbers from 0 to 9, but it's objects or people, etc. So the systems have definitely gotten a lot more complex. And also nowadays we have these generative systems. So on the left, you have ChatGPT giving you a recipe based on a picture of a fridge. And on the right, you have an AI generated video of a chameleon's eye. And so essentially now the systems have gotten a lot better than in the 90s. And I think a key distinction to be made that maybe isn't talked about as such is extractive models versus generative models. So extractive models are ones that can only answer, for example, a category from a list of categories. So here this is image classification. So you have an image and the AI network can only choose one of the categories. So even if you have an image of something that's not in its list of categories, it can't invent a new one. It can't say this is a blue jay when it doesn't have a blue jay in its categories. It can only say this is an anemone fish, for example. And so on the one hand, of course, they're more limited, but on the other hand, they can't hallucinate. They can't make stuff up. Versus this, there's almost an infinite number of combinations and outputs that the model can generate, which is great because it can, for example, generate a recipe. But on the flip side, it can also make things up by combining words in ways that were not present in the training data. And so it can confabulate or hallucinate. And of course, that comes with its risks. And a key kind of risk that we keep on seeing nowadays is this whole overselling and under-explaining AI, which is why I think it's so important to start with kind of the basics, is because currently when we talk especially about generative AI, especially in industry, especially by big tech companies, we emphasize its potential and don't talk about its limitations. So it's really, look at this new system, it could do all these cool things, it can solve all your problems, but they don't talk about what can go wrong. And so that means that the users that are using these tools aren't necessarily aware of the limitations and the risks. And also they think that these systems can do anything, can solve any problem without understanding how they work and how they fail, which is problematic. And my favorite example of this is this paper that came out when GPT-4 was being released. And essentially the paper was talking about how GPT-4 has sparks of artificial general intelligence. And artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is a bit of a legend according to my personal opinion, that the AI will one day be able to do anything, will be able to do anything a human being can do, and that's called AGI. And so these researchers were like, well, GPT-4 has these sparks of AGI, and one of the ways in which they proved this is that it could draw a unicorn, and this is the unicorn that GPT-4 drew. And they were like, look, it's so close to being as smart as a human being. This is the unicorn it drew. And of course, the media covered the title and not examples like this. And so people were talking about how the robots will invade and kill us all or whatever it is. So essentially, we don't see enough about the limitations. But specifically about climate change, let's start with the good news, like the sun in Berlin. Let's start with the good news. How can AI help? One way I like seeing this is from the micro to the macro. So there's applications of AI from atoms all the way up to satellite imagery and kind of planetary scale applications and everything in between. So to give you an example, in the microsphere, AI is used a lot in molecular discovery. So for example, designing new types of batteries. This is potentially very powerful because we know that the lithium-ion batteries that we currently use are imperfect. The way that they're manufactured is not not very environmentally friendly in most cases, and they lose a charge over time, so they have to be replaced. And ideally, if we want to electrify everything and for example, have energy grids that are 100% renewable, well, of course, there are times when there's no sun or no wind, and in this case, batteries are very, very important. And also for electric cars, rather, you need really big batteries. And so, for example, what AI can do is come up with new combinations of molecules that are
Sasha, I think we lost you. Want to check if that's the same for other people?
thousands of combinations of molecules, and then it can generate new combinations based on the patterns that it detects. So, for example, DeepMind released a data set a couple of years ago now with all sorts of combinations and kind of the likelihoods that they will be potentially useful. So this is definitely very, very useful, but the flip side is that they have to be tested. And so, for example, as AI people do, they generate a bunch of data, they generate a bunch of options, but they don't synthesize the molecules. And so after that, chemists and people who actually work in material science need to actually create the molecules and test them for conducting electricity, and that can take time. And so currently, that's kind of where we're at. We have lots of candidates, but now we have to test them in the real world and see whether they hold up outside of the matrix. In terms of mesoscale applications, there's a lot of data that's being gathered, for example, by cameras that are hidden in the wild or by these automatic systems like the one on the right. That's a system developed by a friend of mine, David Rolnick, and essentially what they do is they put them up at night and they take pictures of the insects, mostly moths, that come. They're actually attracted with a special kind of light. So they come and then the system takes pictures of them. And essentially, this is a great way of gathering data because we know that climate change is happening. We know lots of ecosystems are being wiped out. We know all these things, but it's really hard to get data because typically the way that this data was gathered was either scientists going out and, for example, catching moths or taking pictures of animals in the jungle, identifying them, labeling them, and then doing this every day or every month or every year. And that's how we would get data. And of course, that doesn't scale very well. And there's a lot of data that's missing because, there's not experts everywhere. For example, in the far north of Canada, we have absolutely no idea what kind of biodiversity we're losing just because we don't even have data points for that. And so putting systems like this up can help gather that data in real time. And of course, AI can be used for parsing it. One of my favorite examples of this is a nonprofit, a startup called Rainforest Connection. And what they do is they take old cell phones and solar powered and solar panels, and they put them up in the jungle. And essentially, these cell phones have little AI models that listen to the jungle, and they're trained to detect anomalies, notably chainsaws or trucks or even human voices. And so, especially in places where you're not supposed to have people with chainsaws and trucks, they can actually listen to the forest in real time and sound the alarm if they do hear a truck or a chainsaw, and then rangers can be deployed in that particular place, and they don't need to patrol, hundreds of acres or thousands of acres of jungle. And so, for example, this is a pretty good application of AI. It's very efficient. It's very well trained, and it can be used as a tool once again for humans to intervene. There's also analyzing camera trap data. I once spent some time in Costa Rica in a research station, and the number of the number of hours they spend looking at these images that are taken automatically by cameras, essentially that are triggered by motion. And so many of them are empty, and so many of them are blurry, and so many of them are hard to identify. But you can actually train AI models to do this in a scalable way. And so you save lots of time, either just by filtering out empty images, which is already a huge time saver, or by actually figuring out what the species are. And AI can actually also count individuals and can actually recognize specific, for example, quaggas based on their stripes and know that they've been, for example, migrating back and forth. And then on the macro level, there are so many satellites, too many satellites probably, at this point, gathering data about the planet in real time. And we have not only imagery, but we also have LiDAR data, which is essentially like radar data, which means you can have depth, you can have height, you can have all sorts of kind of 3D data. You can also have infrared data. And so essentially we have these satellites that are gathering it in real time 24/7, and a lot of it is public domain. So Sentinel, for example, is a satellite that you can access the data, but of course it's a lot of data. And so doing things by hand is quite complicated. And so what AI can do, like two examples, for on one hand, for example, it can detect emissions. So for example, methane is a gas that's I think over 30 times more potent in terms of of global warming, in terms of the greenhouse effect than CO2. So essentially, it's like 30 times worse. But most of the emissions of methane are either swamps, like melting permafrost, things like that, or landfills. And so in a lot of places, they have landfills, they cover them up, and we don't know where they are, and yet they're leaking methane. And so, what AI can do is based on the infrared satellite imagery, it can detect the actual plumes, like the actual heat signatures of methane leaks, and help figure out where they're happening so that, for example, the methane can be captured, it can be burned as a type of fuel for heating, or it can be just like stored, etc., or cleaned up in order to reduce the emissions. And also, you can even monitor coral reefs from space based on LiDAR data because you can actually go through the water and look how coral reefs are impacted by heat or hurricanes or what have you. So you don't actually need to go down in person. If this is something that is of interest to you, there's a whole community, as I mentioned, Climate Change AI. When I quit Morgan Stanley, I bumped into these people who were essentially in the same boat as I was at the time. We all knew AI and we wanted to fight climate change. And so we wrote this paper, Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning. And then we created Climate Change AI. And there's a website with all these interactive summaries. There are workshops. There are all sorts of summer schools and things like that. So I think that, at this point we what we need are people who kind of will bridge the gap between like there's so many AI people who are interested in this who are doing great work, but a lot of that work gets stuck in the research phase because there's only so far you can go if you just know how to code. And what we need are people really who will take that work, that take that research and bring it into communities that are doing the thing, like for example, material science or biodiversity monitoring or what have you. And so we need more and more of that. I think at this point, of course, it's great to do research and all of that is valid, but we also need a lot of capacity building and community building. And so just to give you an idea, what we did is we made this map, this heat map of different AI applications on the columns, and then different categories of applications in climate change, so electricity, buildings and cities, societal impact, etc. And so essentially to help people from the AI community be like, oh, well, I know computer vision, or I know reinforcement learning, or I know whatever, and then I want to work on buildings and cities, or I want to work on education, and then to help them like really project themselves. And I think that we've had a pretty we're having a pretty good run. And so just to continue my personal story, I quit my job. I was at Mila. I helped write this paper. And then someone asked me, well, what about the cost of your work to the planet? And then I realized that I didn't have a good answer, that I couldn't say, well, yes, the work that I'm doing is a net benefit or net positive. All I had were kind of my own estimations. And so for the last 6 years now, I've been working on quantifying AI's cost to the planet specifically. And so there are a lot of news headlines like this one: training an AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars. And it's true. I mean, in the study, what they did is they studied one particular type of AI model and compared the emissions based on like a specific electricity grid, a specific training procedure. So that is valid, but of course, it's not the case for all AI models. Far from it. And so one of the first studies I ran, and we looked at different AI models. This was at GPT-3 times, so a couple of years ago now. And then we found that depending on the size of the model, depending on how it was trained, depending on the energy mix it was using, it could emit anywhere from, for example, 25 tons of CO2, which was Bloom, the model I was working on. Because it was trained in France with nuclear energy, we were very cognizant of like making efficient training and trying to make it as sustainable as possible. So that was 25 tons versus GPT-3, which was trained in the US on natural gas, mostly grid, and used a lot more power as well. And so that emitted 20 times more for a model of exactly the same size. So they're both 170 something billion parameters. And so essentially there's a really, really big spread in terms of how much carbon and how much energy these models use. And so one of the first things I did with some colleagues at Mila was create a tool called Code Carbon. And essentially the goal of that tool was to help people quantify this because we realized that there was such a huge spread that we needed to help people gather data essentially as scientists. And so we created Code Carbon and it's still ongoing. And what it does is that it runs in parallel to code. It doesn't need to be AI code, it could be any code in Python. And it measures the energy consumption of the hardware, so CPU, GPU, memory. And at the end, it gives you a printout saying, well, this is how much energy you use, and here are some equivalents, just to give you an idea. And it's kind of become the de facto tool that people use in AI for quantifying their energy use. And I do think that it's given people a better idea of how much energy they're using, and also it's being used for conferences as well. So, for example, there's an upcoming conference in computer vision that told everyone that if they're submitting to the conference, they have to use Code Carbon or similar tools to estimate their emissions. And that's really good because once we have more information about that, we can start tracking them over time because that's what's currently missing is that we have very few data points. So this is definitely helping the transparency aspect. But this is all focused on training AI models. So essentially, AI models have this kind of very intense training phase where they see a lot of data, they learn their patterns, and that's what most of the research was focused on. How do we quantify those impacts? But as you well know, nowadays more and more people are using AI. So that's kind of the deployment or the inference phase. And that's a lot harder to measure because as opposed to training, when you have one model running on one data center, even if it's for 3 months, but it's still kind of a very set point in time and space, inference and deployment are very distributed, right? So there's billions of people using these models. They're spread out all over the world on all sorts of data centers by all sorts of companies. And so that's where I've been focused on lately because as it's gotten more and more important, it's important to understand how much energy that's using and how much CO2 it's emitting. And so I ran an experiment last year about AI inference, and we looked at 10 different tasks from text classification, so something like figuring out if a movie review is positive or negative, to answering questions, to classifying images, so what I showed you in the beginning of like, is this a baseball player or a clownfish? Then you have text generation, which is large language models. Then you have image captioning. Actually, it's a very popular use case because you can kind of describe what's on images and, for example, create plugins or descriptions on the internet. And then you have image generation. And so that was the most energy and carbon intensive task. And this is a logarithmic scale, the vertical axis, so it's exponential. It uses exponentially more energy. And what we found is that, for example, text tasks use less energy because, it's relatively low dimension, right? You just have words, you have 2 dimensions. It's just kind of written from just like text. But as soon as you start adding sound, as soon as you start adding images, as soon as you start adding other modalities, then the cost really rises in terms of energy and carbon. And then actually recently I've been working on video, which is even more because you have like 20 frames per second, and then you have however many seconds of video. So it is getting more and more. So if I had to redo this graph now, I think that video generation would be somewhere up here in terms of energy because it's such a compute intensive process. And how is this calculated? Just if you were wondering. So essentially what we do is we take the carbon intensity of a grid. So like here in Canada, here in Quebec, where I am, it's hydroelectricity. So it's very low carbon, but in a lot of places it's some form of non-renewable. So you have the carbon intensity. This is, for example, Ontario. Then you multiply that by the energy draw of the hardware. So for example, wherever you're running, it will use 30 watts of power, for example. So you multiply that, and then you have the time. And so, for example, for all of these experiments and for Code Carbon, this is how we estimate all of that. And even if you don't have tools, you can make proxies. So, for example, if you know that a model was trained for 3 million hours on a specific kind of GPU in Iowa, for example, or Virginia. Virginia in the US is where most data centers are. 75% of data centers are there. So you can already have an idea of how much energy is being used. And so yeah, this is Code Carbon. If you use code at all in your daily practice, please download it and you can integrate it, and it's open source and everything. So it's supposed to be a community tool. And something I've been working on in the most recent year is energy score ratings. And so, with a colleague, he works at Salesforce, and what we realized is that, all of these, even these equivalents and these amounts of energy and CO2, for a lot of people, it doesn't mean much, right? Even if I give you an example of a car or TV or heating, it's still quite abstract. And so, what we did is that we ran hundreds of models ourselves, hundreds of AI models across different tasks, with the goal of measuring how much energy each task uses. And essentially, instead of giving people quantities of energy or quantities of emissions, to give them relative rankings. So maybe if you're in the United States or Canada, you have Energy Star ratings, and in European countries, they have some version of that as well. So the goal is really not to say 3 watt hours, but to say this model is 5-star efficient, this model is 2-star efficient. And so essentially, we've been testing all these models in order to give people an idea. If you want to do image classification, here's a more or less efficient model you can use. And of course, people typically evaluate performance or accuracy, but this is like an extra data point for making the decision so that they're not only looking at what's the most accurate model or what performs best, but also what uses the least energy. And so, for example, for text generation, you can have two models that both generate text, right? But then one will use 19 watt hours for 1,000 queries, and the other one will use 5. And so, of course, that might not seem like a lot. It's probably just a couple of minutes of a light bulb, but once you multiply that by millions of queries, and if you use one model over the other, then it really makes a big difference. And so this is what we're trying to show people, that, if you're creating AI products, if you're developing AI tools, choosing the model that you're starting with can make a really, really big impact overall when you're deploying these tools in society. And something that I really like thinking about as well is rebound effects, because so I helped write this paper with some socio-technical scholars, and we talked about all these different use cases where, sure, when you look at efficiency, even energy use, it can seem like it makes sense, but when you look at the bigger picture, it makes less sense. So, for example, AI systems that improve the efficiency of aircraft. This is a big field of research because you can save greenhouse gas emissions, you can save fuel, you can save money, and so you can make these planes more efficient. But then people might travel more because the tickets are cheaper. So they can have a rebound effect that actually has an opposite impact than what you intended it to have. Similarly, for example, if you have robots, AI systems that do precision agriculture that are meant to save money, improve efficiency, improve yield, what have you, but they can replace underprivileged communities that have traditionally harvested these crops. And so that's often not taken into account when people develop these robots. And so it's really important to think about these rebound effects. And in our paper, for example, we looked at things like dematerialization, right? We might think that AI systems are more sustainable because we don't have, or we almost don't have, dictionaries, maps, recipe books. Recently, I was in the car with my daughters, and I was like, "We used to use paper maps," and they didn't believe me, like literally that paper maps were a thing, that I was that old that I remembered having paper maps. But yeah, so we do have less objects. This can seem more sustainable, right? We have a single phone and we have ChatGPT doing our recipes for us, but what is the cost to the environment and also human knowledge, right? On the one hand, we have these huge data centers that need to process these queries to generate recipes and navigate. And on the other hand, we are becoming very, very hooked on them more and more, so that whereas before we would kind of invent a recipe or think about a recipe, nowadays we would go straight to ChatGPT. And so this has a kind of also a rebound effect on human cognition. I mean, there was a study from MIT recently that showed that over time, people who were dependent on, I think it was ChatGPT, to write essays started using their prefrontal cortex less because they were more and more kind of outsourcing their brain to the machine. There's also e-waste because now we want to upgrade our phones faster and faster, more and more. And so we get more gadgets, we have smart speakers and robots and what have you. And so they really pile up. And recent research has found that like generative AI is the biggest contribution to e-waste and is set to produce 2.5 million tons by 2030, just because people are upgrading faster and faster to have the most recent version of AI, essentially. And we don't talk about this a lot either. And there's my favorite evergreen question of how do we compare replacing humans with AI from an environmental standpoint. And there was this study that came out last year in Nature, which is a very reputable journal, that essentially showed, or purported to show, that a human from the US that writes one page of text is produces, oh yeah, so AI writing produces 130 to 1,500 times less CO2 per page than a human author. And they compared Bloom, which was the AI model that I helped develop, with ChatGPT, with a human being from India and a human being from the US. And their conclusion was that AI is much better for the planet because it uses less CO2. But of course, they don't talk about where the data is coming from. They don't talk about how the models were trained. They only just to get, actually, they took the number from my study of Bloom's carbon footprint, which particularly made me mad because it was taken out of context. But the conclusion is kind of like we should just replace all human beings. And actually, they do human writers and human illustrators and image generation models. And the conclusion is just we should replace them all with AI. But of course, if you look at a footnote, they say emissions analyses do not account for social impacts such as professional displacement, legality, and rebound effects, which I find great because I think personally that if this happens, it's going to be definitely more harm than good. And so, as a conclusion, and looking forward to your questions, I still do believe that AI has the real potential to do good in the world. I was recently doing a talk and they asked me, like, what gives you hope? And I was like, well, I don't know what gives me hope, but I know what gives me anger. That's the way that AI is currently used because I know that we can do better, that it's not necessarily like this. It doesn't have to be like this, but yet we're heading in that direction. So, but I do believe that AI has the potential to do good, but we really need to stay aware of its limitations and misuses. And so some models are very useful in the fight against climate change, while others, notably like large language models, are just making the situation worse because their harms are much bigger than their benefits. And I think that one of the key kind of takeaways is that we need to keep measuring, we need to keep communicating the environmental impacts of AI, and we should be putting this pressure on tech companies to do so as organizations, as users. I think we should keep asking for transparency. And then I think that with every line of code we make, every product we make, every decision we make, we can still reinvent AI's future, and we don't need to kind of accept as a given what is sold to us by big tech companies that this is the only way of doing things. That's not true. There are multiple ways of doing things, and so we should keep pushing to make sure that we try to make AI's future more sustainable.